For this final part of Lockdown Reviews, I want to take a look at the two main RE7 DLCs. I understand that DLC is something of a controversial topic, as while it can be done right, where you buy a full game and then pay a little extra to get a little more, it can also be done wrong. With the likes of Dead Space 3 having the game's official ending paywalled under the guise of DLC content. DLC was also the first stepping stone on the road to the terrible microtransaction and the even worse loot box. These two things represent the absolute worst of the gaming industry, and is something that should not be engaged in at all. Capcom, at least with their RE games of late, have been doing it right. The DLCs for RE2 Remake and RE7 not only add extra to a complete and solid games, but also change up the formula and try to do something different with it. All of the entries are more action focused, and they even have unique mechanics that we'll be talking about later. And since we're now in the land of DLC, I'll be going full spoilers here. So if you haven't played RE7 yet, then, what are you even doing here? Go play it. So let's start with the free one, Not a Hero. So if you finished the base game, then we should all know that Evelyn is a new biological weapon created by unknown parties, designed to control enemies on the battlefield through the use of fungal spores. Once a person has become infected by them, they allow her to manipulate their minds and even transform them physically, creating the monstrous forms of Jack and Marguerite. Why anyone thought this was a good idea for a mass-produced weapon, I'll never understand. But hey, it's not my job to sit in on evil corporation board meetings. I'm just here to blow up their labs and demonstrate the inferiority of these super weapons versus the tried and tested method of point gun at enemy and fire. Come on. We started with a virus that turns people into zombies. Is this really such a stretch? And so let's begin by giving a warm and hearty welcome to the series Chad and my favourite character in the game, Chris Boulder-Smashing Redfield. After dropping the super weapon from the helicopter for Ethan to finish Evie off with, and getting Mr. Winters and his loving wife Mia away from the Baker estate, Chris and his team stick around to clean up the mess and bring in the game's very own jigsaw wannabe psychopath, Lucas Baker. Lucas, in my opinion, is a prime contender for most annoying enemy ever conceived. And there are definitely strengths to this. He is a hateful character, and his writing and voice acting all work to really get under your skin and make you really want to kill this guy. And while I get that this was the desired effect, I'm not entirely sure it was to the benefit of the game. We are challenged by Lucas after defeating Marguerite in the old house and are basically made to run his gauntlet in order to rescue Zoe and Mia. In Ethan's story, this is the beginning of a fairly big tone switch in the game. The first two areas work very hard to build suspense slowly, and aren't shy about leaving you alone for quite a long time. You enter an area, explore it, maybe solve a few puzzles, until you hit some major milestone, and either Jack or Marguerite are now patrolling to find you. This game of cat and mouse climaxes with you being cornered into a fight with them, before defeating them and moving on. Now, I completely agree that the game needed to switch it up at this point in order to avoid getting stale for the next session, but this... really? I don't really want to turn this into a long rant, but I cannot stand Saw. It is to my mind one of the worst things to ever happen to the entire horror genre, and I've watched The Wishmaster. This game draws inspiration from Silent Hill 2, which is a horror masterpiece unto itself, one of the kings of Grindhouse B-movies, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and fucking Saw. How am I mentioning these things in the same sentence? Look, I know the first movie is supposed to be some low-budget psychological thriller classic, but I had that spoiled for me, and watched the second movie first, and all I saw was an awfully plotted story about a man putting people into overly elaborate death traps and then saying he never killed anybody because cancer or something. And this utter abomination in storytelling managed to get 7 sequels, even surviving the original villain's death. Good lord, what is wrong with people? It's not like anyone ever wrote a good story about a man dying from cancer, let down by the American healthcare system, and finally breaking free of social conformity to reveal himself to be a true monster inside. No, that's never been done well at all, has it? So Lucas's testing area is this kind of maze of tripwires and other booby traps. No, wait. Just tripwires. Like, so many of the damn things. And yeah, you can probably catch all of them by creeping really slowly through every inch of the map, but you're most likely just going to run into a few, get blown up, and then reload your last save so you know where they are next time. And it's not fun. At all. It's the kind of puzzle that doesn't give you any incentive to do it right. Kind of like with Mr. X. It's such a chore to deal with this stuff that I'd rather cheese my way through it than actually play the game the way I'm supposed to. The enemy count in this area is also quite high, so when you're not wasting bullets blowing up trip mines, you're trying to fight off more molded, some of which just spawn in behind you without warning, which is a total cheap shot, and has no business being in any well-designed level. It's not so bad on your second playthrough because you kind of remember where everything is, but that just means there isn't much challenge to the area at all beyond the combat. This all climaxes in some elaborate puzzle room, which is solved by watching a video of some other poor sod being trapped in the same horrible situation and getting the code you need without having to torture yourself in order to do it. This last part certainly is different, but again, I can't stand Saw, and I've just got better things to do with my time than dance to this sicko's tune while he rubs one out in the back room. Unlike the other family members, Lucas, you see, isn't an unwilling participant in Evelyn's game of happy families. By looking around his bedroom, you can discover he was always something of a psycho, and actually locked one of his schoolmates in the attic and let him die up there. Though that body is never found, and there are a lot of questions I have to ask about how that played out, but whatever. Not long after Evie infects the family, he is actually discovered and effectively cured of her influence by unknown parties, and is transmitting information on Evie and the Molded to them from a base in the mines near the house. There's actually a full lab set up there where they're running tests on the Molded and observing the whole situation with the Baker family. In the main game, we never get any closure on his story, however, as we never get to fight him. He escapes when Ethan thwarts his final game and Jack 2.0 breaks into the area for the final showdown. But that's why Chris is here. He's under orders to hunt down and bring Lucas in alive and rescue his captured teammates in the process. And no doubt you can imagine that none of that is going to go smoothly at all, as we are once again thrust into one of Lucas's infuriating death mazes, complete with new more dangerous enemies, yet more effing tripwires and wall grenades, and even a bomb attached to our own wrist. Fortunately, Chris is not Ethan Winters. The series Chad is buffer and tougher than ever, and decked out in full combat gear, armed with his trademark Samurai Edge handgun and a combat shotgun. Chris isn't here to mess around. He moves faster and is better armed than Ethan. His helmet even has a cool holographic heads-up display, which really sends the message that we are no longer playing a horror game. This is an action game. Fast-paced, high-octane power fantasy. And to top it all off, Chris's fists of iron can one-shot any Molded stunned with his guns. As Chris explores the mines, he finds his teammates locked into other elaborate death traps that they inevitably fall to. But that's okay, because they're just upgrade machines anyway. There are several hazards that Chris is unprepared for, such as dangerous gas clouds that require a filter upgrade to his mask, and pitch-dark tunnels that need a night vision upgrade. These serve to lock Chris into a fairly linear route through the level, and it's overall pretty tight. There are also new enemy types that are immune to damage from regular weapons and must, initially, be stunned and bypassed until the special anti-regeneration bullets, the same used to finish off Evie, can be found. These are, however, in much more limited supply than regular bullets, so they need to be used sparingly. All in all, this was actually a lot of fun though. Just a straight up action romp with some of the weaker elements from the base game thrown into boot. While Chris feels much more responsive than Ethan, the controls are sluggish when compared to an actual FPS, which does make some of the fights somewhat frustrating at times. Lucas, likewise, is as annoying as ever, taunting you over your comlink and filling your screen with his hideous face, at times when you'd really rather not deal with him, but there is an incredibly satisfying ending to all of this when you finally get the drop on him and I don't think I'll ever get tired of seeing this.
Game over.
And again. And again. And again. And one more time, please, Chris. So maybe the writing worked its magic after all. Now this was an absolute trip to play. Much like Not a Hero, End of Zoe does away with any pretense of being a horror game and is very much about action, with one big difference. End of Zoe has no ranged weapons. Well, aside from some crudely made spears, that is. That's right. Move over, Chris, because Resident Evil has a new Chad. Big Joe Baker is going to battle the hordes of monsters and even the terrifying Jack Baker with his bare hands.
Alright, you moldy motherfucker. I can take you fucking with my bare hands.
And while the adaptation phase to this new combat loop was a little frustrating, I can honestly say that this might be some of the most fun you can have in a Resident Evil game. The setup here is pretty basic, but does leave me wondering about one thing. You see, in Resident Evil 7's main story, at a pivotal moment in the game, Ethan is forced to choose between saving either his wife Mia, a woman who greeted him after a 3-year absence by chainsawing off one of his hands, or her sister Zoe, who has been doing everything she can to help Ethan stay alive up until this point. Depending on who you choose, there will be a minor change to the ending, but both this DLC and Resident Evil 8 clearly canonize the choice to save Mia. And of course Ethan would save his wife. That was his whole motivation in coming to the Baker house in the first place. So I wonder why we ever had the choice at all. It didn't really add anything of value to the narrative. Now, maybe it was different for people playing back when the game first came out, and before they knew anything about this DLC, but the impact of the choice is still cheapened even after the fact. That aside, here's Joe Baker, a real MGTOW man of the wild who eats bugs, lives off the wild land, and shaves with broken glass. Sorry, what's that? Oh yeah, real men don't shave. When he finds a lot of Black Ops types running around his land, he goes to investigate, and finds a few of them crouched over the now crystallized body of his niece. Joe, you see, is a man who takes family very seriously. I mean, not seriously enough to drop in any time in the last 3 years, and notice that his brother and his wife had turned into horribly mutated monstrosities, but seriously enough to lose control and start swinging before he talks to anyone, only stopping to ask questions of someone once he's got them securely restrained in his cabin. He gets a too long didn't read version of the story from 7, and told that he needs to find a serum in order to save Zoe. And that's really as deep as the story gets here. Old Man beats up monsters making use of the stealth mechanics to perform some of the most satisfying stealth takedowns I've seen in a very long time, throws spears at mutated gators, and pummels enemies until their head explodes with his fists. And man, this is so much fun. The primary antagonist of this game is the mindless remains of Jack, who has now mutated into a kind of Swamp Thing style monster, and seems to want to personally pummel his brother with his own fists. This leads to a couple of great boss fights, with the finale seeing Joe rocking a full power fist that he can use to knock his brother soaring across the room with. I mean, just look at this moment.
What the hell is this? One of their fancy toys?
Ready for use.
The whole thing has power fantasy written all over it, especially when played right after the main game. You spend so much of the main game on the back foot that it is incredibly satisfying to come into this and just start messing up Molded like you're the goddamn Doomslayer. I mean, look at some of these takedowns. Overall, this was a blast to play through, and one thing I really liked about both these DLCs was they really tried to create something a little different with each one. They could have just made more of what we got in the base game, but it just wouldn't have worked to have an RE series vet like Chris stealthing around helplessly like Ethan. The action format served to not only provide a much faster paced experience, but also display the ultra competence of a man who's been in this fight from the very beginning, and further reinforcing why we needed a new protagonist in the first place. Joe's story, on the other hand, is just an absurd power trip, and my only regret is there isn't more of it. And with that said, hopefully Ethan and Mia can fly off into the sunset together, put this nightmare behind them, and live happily ever after. What's that? Romania? No, there aren't any werewolves in Resident Evil. Tall vampire lady. How tall? Uh-huh. They're that big. Chris does what now?
You killed Mia. Now do me and finish the job.
Oh, that sounds bad. Like, really bad. Ah, crap.
Ethan Winters, welcome